Hello and welcome back to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm your host this week, E. Today we're going to be talking with one of our historical linguists, Rusoved, also known as Ryan, and we'll be discussing Balkan linguistics, Slavic and Albanian, as well as historical linguistics more generally. So let's get to it. Also, just a quick heads up, I recorded this in a different room that I'm in right now, so my voice is about to sound quite different after the break.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome back. I'm here with Ryan, one of our historical linguistics flares. You may know him from Reddit as Rusoved. Ryan, could you tell us what that means?
It's a sort of like weird formation so like Rus is like Russia, Russian, and then Ved is an old root that means know, like to know something, not an O, no. But
so what would the proper pronunciation of that be then?
So like Rusoved, I guess.
Oh, that sounds a lot better than the way I said it. Cool.
I mean, yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us. You have your master's in Slavic linguistics, yes?
Yes, that is correct.
And how did you get into that? What interested you about historical linguistics or linguistics in general, and Slavic in particular?
Yeah, so I started taking Russian in college, and I really enjoyed taking it. And what got me sort of into Slavic linguistics was so part of it was a previous interest in linguistics, but another part of it was like seeing a lot of generalizations that my textbook was making that were like weird and didn't seem quite right and seemed incomplete somehow. And then other stuff that it just didn't remark on at all, but seemed to be there.
Do you mean sort of like a disconnect between what you were learning and what was clearly actually happening with the language?
Yes. So that was a big part of it. And then the other half of it was just like noticing things that my textbook never mentioned, but that looked to me like significant somehow, or like there was a story there.
Do you have an example of something like that?
Yeah. So Russian has has this sort of weird for Slavic adjective setup. So if you look at Russian pronouns, the Russian third person pronouns, so like he or she, certain forms of the pronoun are identical almost to certain adjective endings. And I remember noticing this like towards the end of my first year of Russian and thinking like, that's weird. Why do these look the same? Like that can't be by chance. Turns out, in fact, it's not by chance. Russian took like a large number of its adjective endings. Like they got them basically by affixing pronouns onto the ends of adjectives.
Sure, okay. Grammaticalization.
Yeah, yes, yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. And why Russian in the first place, though? I mean, why not Spanish or French or Chinese or something?
It was mostly a whim. I was sort of interested in Russian from some history classes I'd taken in high school, but it was mostly just a whim.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's sort of how I got into a lot of what I ended up doing with my life as well, so.
Yeah.
Now, do you only work with Russian, or did you sort of look into Slavic more generally and languages outside of Slavic that might be nearby, or was it pretty much just all Russian all the time?
So it was mostly just Russian. I especially in my master's program, I did a decent amount of coursework on Balkan languages with like a heavy-ish focus on Albanian out of those. But for the most part, it's like Russian, Old Church Slavonic, some, and Albanian.
Now, Albanian is not Slavic, right?
It is not, in fact, no. It is for not the most part. It's like Russian.
Old Church Slavonic is?
Yes. It's a little bit like sort of Latin is to Romance languages, except not a direct ancestor in quite the same way.
So we can say, for example, like French and Spanish are coming from some form of Latin, but that's not the case with Old Church Slavonic.
So Old Church Slavonic developed after the three main branches of Slavic started to split apart. So you have East Slavic, which is the three big languages there are going to be Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian. You have East Slavic, which includes Polish, Czech, Slovak, and then you have South Slavic, so Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Macedonian, and Bulgarian. And those three groups started to split before Old Church Slavonic, the sort of canon of texts of it that we have, which isn't a lot, were written down. OCS was sort of begun in what's now modern day Bulgarian Macedonia. It's definitely South Slavic. Some OCS texts have features that we can relate pretty clearly to Bulgarian, to Macedonian. There are some manuscripts that show reflexes you see in modern Serbian, which is another way it's like different from classical Latin, which had at least at one point had this very small, well, comparatively small speech community centered around, Rome, its environs in central Italy.
You said there's certain features that are reflexes. Could you just explain what a reflex is?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So that's just a later outcome of an earlier sound.
So could we say something like what? Knife is spelled with a K. That K might be a reflex of some earlier K sound?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Now, working in the Balkans, I know, can be a little bit tricky. I've spent some time there myself, and I've heard plenty of stories. Do you run into any sort of political issues or any sort of just that kind of problem with dealing with linguistics in the Balkans?
Yeah, it just sort of looms over most work people who do Balkan linguistics do, especially when you're talking about like historical linguistics. You have to get into these questions of where things came from. For instance, with Albanian. So our first Albanian texts, if I recall correctly, date from the 15th century. So that's like our first text in something that's like identifiably Albanian.
It's like an ancestor dialect or something.
Yeah. I'm not sure which dialect of modern Albanian it's sort of related to most closely.
But clearly Albanian. It's not. There's no question that it's not Greek or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. No. It's Albanian for sure. I think it's like a baptismal formula or something.
It seems reasonable.
Yeah. So that's really late for European languages.
Yeah, definitely.
Our earliest Slavic texts are like 9th century or so. I mean, you've got Latin before, like another millennium before that, right?
Right.
Greek even before that.
What might it mean that it comes in so late? I mean, clearly it doesn't mean that this language just sprang out of nowhere, right?
No, absolutely not. It means that like whoever the ancestors of the Albanians were, they didn't have a literary tradition.
They weren't writing things down.
They weren't writing. Yeah, at least in their own language. They might have been using another language, conceivably, to write things. But
so how does that get into the sort of political situation of like Albanian identity and modern issues in the Balkans?
Yeah, so we don't have Albanian texts before the 15th century, but we have like mentions of people in what's now like modern Albania or like Greater Albania, to include Kosovo, areas of northern Greece, etc. So like we have these groups around so the big one really here is the Illyrians, which if people have played Rome Total War, they probably encountered.
Right.
And we know vanishingly little about this group of people, which means you can make them work as ancient Albanians, or you can just say like we don't really know, honestly.
That is sort of a lot of people sort of take that position, right? That the Illyrians are the ancestral Albanians. I mean, in Albania, you hear this a lot.
Yes, yeah. It's sort of like if you look at a text about like the history of Albanian, written by an Albanian linguist, like they're gonna discuss the Illyrian hypothesis, and they're gonna be pretty favorable to it.
Right.
Because it gives Albanians really nice classical bona fides, places them in the spot that roughly in the spot that Albania is now. All that, it's just everything you want for a nice nationalist narrative about your country, right?
But we don't have any records of Illyrian language that looks like Albanian today.
I mean, not really. We don't really have much record of Illyrian, like, whatsoever. I think we have some names, and that's, like, about it.
Yeah. I mean, this can be a big issue with place names as well, right? Because those can change, or they're borrowings, or they, even like Shkodra up in the north is linked to Scutari as Latin names and all these sort of things like this. So even place names aren't necessarily all that helpful.
Yes.
In historical linguistics.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And there's also the problem with Albanian that it has like a very large layer of vocabulary inherited from Latin at a very early date, and it has like later layers of vocabulary also inherited from like Latin, from like later Latin, has layers of vocabulary from Greek, from Slavic, from Turkish.
Right.
There's not a lot of like bona fide inherited Albanian roots.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So like even if we found somehow a like trove of Illyrian texts, it would take some work, I think, to actually relate them to like very clearly to Albanian, honestly.
Okay. Before we get into the sort of comparative method and the way that we can do that, are there any other significant political issues that come up beyond the concept of Illyrian and Albanian? Yeah,
so I guess the other sort of big one that comes to mind, at least that I've had to talk about in coursework and research stuff, is Old East Slavic and who gets to inherit sort of the legacy of Kievan Rus and its successor states in what's now Russia, Belarus, Ukraine. So I mentioned earlier 3 branches of Slavic.
Right.
One of them, East Slavic, is composed of Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and that's Old East Slavic as a term is sort of new scholarly in terms of in scholarly circles, and it's not a term you're going to find in that particular form in like Slavic language linguistics sources, honestly.
How would they refer to it?
So depending on where they're from, you're going to find them talking about so in Russian it will be Staroruski, Old Russian, or Drevny Ruski, sorry. So like ancient Russian, early Russian.
Right.
I believe the Ukrainian is like Drevny Ukrainsky, and Belarusian is going to be a similar formulation, but Belarusian.
Right.
So you have like these 3 political linguistic groups all claiming the exact same set of texts and linguistic forms, as their own heritage, in a way that sort of excludes the other 2 groups, right?
So it's not necessarily the analysis of the language; it's just the terminology applied to it by the different powers who have an interest in it.
Yeah, exactly. And you see it. I mean, it's an outgrowth. In this linguistic domain, it's just an outgrowth of claims about history that you see made. Like there's a saying in Russian, like Kiev is the mother of Russian cities, and in Russian it helps that there's this. So I mentioned Kievan Rus earlier. So Kievan Rus is our name for sort of the earliest East Slavic political entity that was centered around Kiev in what's now Ukraine. And they called themselves the Rus, which is from a Norse term for rowers, basically, because Rus was sort of, it involved, some Vikings show up and sort of do it's contested exactly what the deal was, but Vikings are involved, some colonization is involved, not a whole lot of them came, and you don't see like a large Norse influence on Russian or East Slavic itself. So like there weren't a lot of them, but they were like politically influential and they did bring a name.
Right.
And they also brought like lots of personal names as well. But
so the name Russia isn't even Russian then.
In English, we call them the Rus. In Russian, it's also Rus, and the adjective for that is Ruski, which is coincidentally the adjective for Russian as well.
Right.
So there's this sort of like linguistic sleight of hand going on there.
Interesting. So how do you go about doing this kind of research? Let's say that we found that Illyrian text, or we found some. Actually, I'm going to stop myself because I had one more question to ask before we jump into that. So click. This is possibly a dangerous follow-up question, but is there a right answer to the East Slavic question for the terminology? Is there one of the three that gets to lay a better claim to it?
No. And the name for, so like in modern Russian, Russia is Россия now, which is also just like a borrowing basically of the Greek word for Russia. So doubly not Russian in a way.
I see what you mean, though. So it's not so much that necessarily only one of them came about from this sort of Old East Slavic. It's just that Old East Slavic is much more of the proto form.
Uh-huh.
I mean, not proto exactly, but like the sort of ancestral form.
Sure.
So the issue is more that the different parties are excluding the others rather than any one of them has more of a claim to it than the others. It's the exclusion that's the problem.
Uh-huh.
So let's talk a little bit about how we work this out then. So let's say we find this Illyrian text and we have this great corpus of data of what Illyrian really was. How can we then work out if Illyrian is the ancestor of Albanian, or let's say we find another dialect hidden in the mountains, south of Gjirokastra or something. How do we figure this stuff out? How do we work with languages that weren't written down?
So what you need to do basically is get a bunch of different you need to just get a bunch of words. You just collect a lot of words, a shit ton of words. All of the words.
Like as many words as you can.
Yes. Yeah, you just want a lot of words, and you want a lot of words from a lot of different like groups that you think are related. Right?
Right.
And you want to do it like systematically so that you're not getting like a handful of different so that you have like words for the same things, right? Or similar things.
Okay. So could you give an example, like maybe something that uses either Slavic languages or something with Albanian or anything really?
Yeah. So let's say you're working on Slavic. And you go and you find a bunch of words, and you look at your list, and we're just going to start with the word for hand. You've got Belarusian ruka, Russian ruka, Ukrainian ruka. Then you've also got Bulgarian raka, Macedonian raka, Serbian, Croatian ruka.
Okay.
Slovene will have roka. Czech, Ruka, Kashubian is going to be, Kashubian is a small dialect spoken in Poland, related to Polish. So that's Ranka. You've got Polish Renka. You've got Slovak Ruka, and that's sort of the big ones.
So we know that these are all obviously similar words.
Yeah.
So if we had another one that was like something completely different, would you then throw that out for the sake of comparison, or is that still a value?
So it's not going to be a value in necessarily for figuring out what exactly so with all of these, they all share three segments, right? They all share the R and the Ka and the Ah, right? Mm-hmm. But we need to figure out what that first vowel was. So it's not going to be useful for that task. But it's conceivably useful for figuring out other sorts of relationships. I guess so. Maybe it's and potentially relationships with like other groups of languages, right? Maybe that are less
Right,
closely
right.
related to it.
How can you work out in certain cases? Because presumably, if all these languages are in the same basic geographic area and they're all talking to each other, there must be some level of exchange that's happening. So how do you know that these are all words that are derived from a common source as opposed to they developed in a couple of these languages and then were borrowed into the others? Is there a way that you can work that out?
Well, so yeah, there is a way you can work it out. You need again, you need a lot more words than just the one, right? Than just the one set. Um, and basically, what you need to look for is consistent correspondences between particular sets of languages, where Russian has u and Bulgarian has and Serbian and Croatian have u and Slovene has o, and Czech has u and Polish has eh.
So consistency is the key. As long as what you're seeing goes across multiple words or multiple syllables, and is the same from language to language to language and how they relate to each other, that's sufficient grounds to say that these are related.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
So how is Albanian?
Albanian is super fucking weird. Albanian was one of the last European languages. I think it was the last European language that is a part of Indo-European, this sort of large language family stretching from India to Europe, that includes English, Russian, German, Albanian, obviously, Romance, along with Hindi related languages, and Persian and related languages. And Albanian just has a lot going on. I mentioned earlier that it has a lot of different layers of loanwords, of borrowings.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot from Turkish and Latin and
Yeah,
all sorts of stuff. Right?
yes, Slavic to Greek. So that in itself makes it hard to do this comparative method, because you want ideally stuff that wasn't borrowed in to do this work. Because if it is borrowed in, then you can work with it, you can handle it,
Right.
but it's tough. It's tougher.
So if you have a bunch of things that weren't borrowed in, is it easy to work out? So you mentioned before that if you have consistency in correspondences, that helps you work it out. But that seems like a huge amount of work if you're just getting started, because you don't necessarily know what's borrowed and what's not, right? So are there sort of indications or things that you can already point to as a starting place in this?
Yeah, so that's for sure right. I guess it's sort of harder for me to talk about like the just getting started out part, because, with Indo-European, like we've had a decently good idea of the contours of what it looks like for like 100 years now.
Yeah, you guys have it pretty easy compared to our end of it.
Yeah, like when you learn about Indo-European, you're generally not doing a whole lot of original research. It's learning about the correspondences that other people, chumps, have already figured out, and you just get to learn from them.
Are you calling Grimm a chump?
I mean, he did a lot of work that I don't have to do, and I respect that for sure.
Yep. So what's some of the weird stuff that Albanian does then? So, Albanian's pretty crazy. When I started trying to learn it, there was a lot going on that I had trouble, 13-year-old me had trouble wrapping my head around. What's some of the stuff that's going on in Albanian?
So the big one, I think, the really big one is that so in Indo-European languages, you frequently see some weird stuff happening with S, the consonant S.
Mm-hmm.
And usually you're going to have some words where it's preserved from Proto-Indo-European. So let me think of... Okay. So S from Proto-Indo-European, it frequently turns into like an H. It sometimes turns into like a Z or an R,
Yep.
depending on where it is in a word. And it also just a lot of the time in a lot of Indo-European languages just sticks around. So you've got like the English verb to sit, which you have in Russian. You have a related verb sидеть. There's a bunch of other Slavic verbs that are related. You have Latin sedeo. You've got a Greek verb that's going to have an H because this S is word initial. But you have like some version of it. And usually like word initial S is going to turn out as H in Greek or as nothing, depending. And it's just going to...
And that's pretty common cross-linguistically, too. That's not something that's just unique to Greek, right? A lot of these kind of changes we see happening in languages all over the world.
Yes.
So how does that work out in Albanian, then?
So in Albanian, you have S turn into, like, 7 different things. You get S as a J sound, a G, or like a G or a J sound, depending on where in Albania you're at. So you've got the word six, jasht, where that J is, the outcome of an S.
Right.
You've got H, an H, so naha, us. You've got sh for a word so you've got like pressure, hail. You've got th, so jeth, so the word leaf, an SD cluster. You've got H from like an SK cluster. You've got F from an SP cluster. So the Albanian word fjal, word, is related to English speech.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of these are things that we are seeing, that we see these consistently. So there's going to be a number of cases where 6 turns into this J sound, this GJ is how it's written. And there's going to be a number of cases where you had mentioned that like R and S sometimes switch. So like flocis became floris in Latin for like flower, right?
Yeah, this SG thing, it's real. You get it in a bunch of other words. So the Albanian word for snake is cognate with serpent, jarper. You've also got, I think, gerb, to drink or to gulp, which is related to this Latin verb sorbeo. A couple more that are straightforward. Sleep. So like Greek has hypnos, Russian has this word son, Albanian it comes out as jum.
Is Albanian unique in how many different ways that something like this one proto-S can be realized, or is it unique because the ways that it's realized are so different from other Indo-European languages?
Just about every Indo-European language has a couple of sounds that just sort of are all over the place in how they come out compared to protoforms. I think it's mostly just like you just have such a breadth of reflexes of Proto-Indo-European S in Albanian. That's weird. This J, this H, this sh, a th, a h, a f. It's just a bunch of different things. And usually you have a more limited set of things for S, especially, at least in the sort of Indo-European languages that I'm familiar with. There's not nearly as much
right.
Going on there.
But S is also not the only place where this sort of thing is happening, right?
No, it's not for sure. It's not. Although it is sort of the most extreme, and the most interesting, I'd say. Okay,
so today, if we want to work backwards and sort of work out the historical form that an ancestral language would have had, we're looking at a lot of sort of modern dialects and whatever. Written records are helpful, but of course writing doesn't always reflect speech. So the dialects that people are speaking, the varieties they're speaking, are sort of the most helpful way. Prior to the comparative method, how were people doing this kind of work? How did people like Grimm really manage to work out some of the relationships within Indo-European or other languages?
Well, I mean, Grimm, right? Grimm and his colleagues, they worked out the comparative method, right? Right, like that was sort of an invention of the neo-grammarians, right? That group of scholars that included Grimm and some other philologists that were contemporary to him and his brother.
What was before this? I mean, so
before there wasn't really historical linguistics, right? It was there were people writing stuff who were noticing, that's weird. These languages look similar. So you've got Sir William Jones, who was British. I think he might have been Welsh, and he was a judge, if I recall correctly, working in India, in British India. He sort of unusually managed to sort of learn some Sanskrit. Very not unusually, he had a classical education, so he already knew Greek and Latin very well. I think he also knew Gothic. And so while he was studying Sanskrit, he noticed some very obvious similarities between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin. And of course, anyone who has learned Greek or Latin will notice some similarities between those in English. But Jones was the first guy, well, not the first, but one of the first, to sort of state this, to remark on the relationship between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. So there's a passage from an address he gave to the Asiatic Society. Quote, the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. End quote. So, yeah.
So that's sort of then the beginning of it as a field, right? I mean, as a field, historical linguistics really is quite young. I mean, maybe not young now anymore, but it certainly doesn't go back as far as records of the kings ruling of the country and more sort of standard historical texts that we might find.
Sure. Yeah. And it's definitely like the oldest, discipline within linguistics, I'd say.
Right.
And that's, still that's still sort of like predating, that speech is still sort of predates the real birth of historical linguistics, which I think is, the comparative method.
Right.
And it's also worth pointing out, I think the Russian grammarian Lomonosov, I believe it was, had already published some stuff discussing similarities between, Germanic and Romance and Slavic, although he also had included some other stuff that was just like totally off base. So it's not the first, Jones isn't the first guy to suggest, hey, these languages are related to each other. He's just I think he's specifically the first to propose that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin were. And then he also, from what I understand, did have like some role in sort of kicking off in like scholarly inquiry of that relationship. Was more influential.
Right.
He was just more influential than some predecessors.
So that's sort of the beginning of the field. What are some of the more recent achievements in historical linguistics that you may be aware of?
In the last decade or so, there's been sort of a turn towards using computer algorithms to do comparative work, or like an aspect of comparative work. So like trying to date Indo-European. Well, trying to date things is definitely not a thing as recent as the last 10 years, but there's like
different methods for how to do it.
Yeah, there's some newer methods in the last 10 years, I should say, that seem reasonable and seem to come up with the right dates, at least as we understand. They sort of come up with dates that work with the dates that linguists working things out by hand sort of have come up with for Proto-Indo-European and its offshoots.
Do they match the archaeological record as well, or is that still something that's eluding the combined fields?
Well, so dating Proto-Indo-European, right? Linguists and archaeologists sort of favor different time frames. At least the work that I'm familiar with tends to agree more with the dating that linguists come up with than the dating schemes popular in archaeology.
What are some of the other major issues within linguistics that you would like to see addressed? Are there things that are sort of personal bugaboos?
Yeah, well, So I personally have, I think this isn't exactly a question about historical linguistics, but it's a question that historical linguistics can really like help us in answering. But one of my big research interests is like what's the nature of a linguistic representation? What does it mean to know like a word? Like what sort of information does your brain store about like the sound shape of a word? How detailed is it? How abstract is it? Do you just have this like sort of very generalized schema of a word? Or do you have, so like that's sort of one pole of thinking on it. Another pole of thinking is that like every time you hear a word, your brain just sort of files it away along with a bunch of data about like who said it, when they said it, where they said it, like what like social context they said it, who the like sort of what social groups the person saying it belonged to. And I think historical linguistics, it has something to say, I think, about that, the nature of linguistic representations. It's like historical linguistics, right, is fundamentally about sound change, and that is there's not a lot of sort of groundwork to do, especially in Indo-European linguistics, at least on the European side of things. We've got a pretty solid base about a lot of stuff, but I think there's a lot of good data in there that we can bring to bear on this question of linguistic representations.
Okay. So aside from that, what do you think the future of the field looks like? What will historical linguistics be in 20 years, 30 years? What do you hope it will be?
Yeah. So I guess, I don't know that it will be in 20 or 30 years. Unfortunately, it's not a popular field, particularly there aren't a lot of jobs in it. Right. And I don't see that changing. So that's concerning. But
are robots going to take over historical linguistics?
Man, I wish they would, because someone needs to keep doing it.
Yeah, no kidding.
I think it's possible that people will keep doing this work on algorithms to, help us figure out dates and stuff. But even the thing about that is like the recent work on like doing historical that like does the comparative method algorithmically with a computer. The problem there is that it still needs a person to sort through all of these to like put together the correspondence sets in the first place, right? We are not at a place where
collect the data.
Yeah, we're not at a place where we can trust a computer to put together the sort of bare bones correspondence sets you need to actually do the work.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Which is a big obstacle.
Right. So at least for now, the 4 jobs that are available in North America in historical linguistics are safe.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. Yeah. 4 of you will get jobs.
It's a little dismal, a little grim.
Yep, very grim.
Good. Well, I think that does it for today. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been an interesting conversation.
Great. Thanks.
And thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.